It's tough to know exactly when a marriage starts to fall apart, especially when trust has always been there. My wife suddenly told me that after 25 years of marriage, she fell in love with someone else at first sight. I was devastated. But what really shocked me was what she said next. Do you remember that scene in The Godfather when Michael Corleone sees that woman in Italy and falls in love instantly? His bodyguard said something about how he'd been struck by love's lightning bolt. I didn't recognize it back then, but I saw that moment in my wife's eyes. The only difference was that it wasn't. When she met me, it was 25 years into our marriage, and she'd already met another man. That was the first crack in what I thought was a perfect life. I tend to jump ahead when I think back on how things should have played out differently, but maybe I ought to start from the beginning. My name's Brandon Williams, though most folks call me Brand. I'm 50 now. I live in a small Midwestern city about 2 hours from Chicago. I work as an accountant for a large company that operates all across the country. It's not the most thrilling job, but the paychecks are good, and I rarely have to put in more than 40 hours a week except during tax season. No weekend work either. I was married until 2 years ago. That's my ex. My wife and I have a daughter, Madison. She's 25 now, married with a kid of her own living out in Denver. After 26 years, I thought my marriage was great, but Rachel and I ended up getting divorced. I first met Rachel back in my sophomore year at Iowa State University. She had just transferred to my dorm after her first year at another school. I remember it vividly, an August day with the sun blazing down on Iowa, and there she was, standing outside the dorm I was walking in with some friends. I half-jokingly told them, "I'm going to introduce you to." I introduced myself to the future Mrs. Williams. My friends looked over at her. She was a stunning blonde sunbathing on a towel in a bikini. They were impressed. I couldn't tell who said what. I was completely taken by her. I left my buddies behind and walked right up to her. I got up to her, but just as I got within a few feet, she propped herself up on one elbow and waved me off. I felt my heart sink until she spoke, "Hey genius, you're blocking my sun." I quickly shuffled to the right, letting the sun flood back over her. She flashed a smile so bright that I was practically blinded by her beauty. I would have done anything she asked. She was confident and didn't seem bothered that a stranger had just approached her. I figured she was used to dealing with that. I introduced myself and asked her out for Friday night. If I said yes, she teased, would I wipe the drool off my chin? I fumbled for a response. I said, "Oh, yeah." She laughed at my awkwardness. She was clearly amused. He wasn't one of those guys with rehearsed pickup lines, so I said, "Let's go out on Friday." I got her number, and by Friday night, we were having dinner at a cozy Italian place in Ames. She talked about a lot of stories about her life, starting from when she was 3 years old. She didn't stop until our food arrived. We clicked immediately. In just a month, we were practically inseparable, spending all our free time together. She wasn't just beautiful, she was smart, funny, and brimming with confidence. I was just an average guy, not the best looking, but I played sports. I did well in school, and I always knew I wasn't the smoothest talker. But I felt good around Rachel. Asking her out was a long shot, but sometimes you have to shoot your shot. Right, Rachel and I slept together for the first time on our 6th date. Neither of us had much experience, but I had a secret weapon. I'd actually read the articles in those adult magazines. Based on the feedback I'd gotten from past partners, I wasn't too shabby at putting that knowledge to good use. We tied the knot soon after graduating. We both found jobs easily, Rachel as a 3rd-grade teacher and me in accounting with a steady income. We bought a house a couple of years later and, about a year after that, Madison was born. Life was good. Our sex life wasn't overly adventurous, but it was satisfying for both of us as the years went on. Work and age slowed us down a bit, but even after Madison went off to college, we still had a strong connection. Having sex a few times a week, every now and then I'd catch myself wondering if Rachel might cheat on me. She'd tell me about the occasional she was a flirt at her school, but she never seemed interested. I put it down to my own insecurities. Rachel was undeniably attractive, and I couldn't blame anyone for noticing her. But that's all it was, admiration. I made it clear early on that I wasn't into sharing, and she agreed as long as I didn't act on any glances I gave other women. She was fine with it. We had clear boundaries, and I respected them. That was our deal until about 3 years ago. Every year, our neighbors, Shane and Lindsay Daniels, threw a massive summer party at their house. I lived just 3 doors down in our upscale neighborhood. The bash always happened the weekend after the 4th of July. Rachel and I never missed it. Everyone on the block showed up, and it was always a blast. Shane and Lindsay were great hosts with loads of food, drinks, a huge pool, and even a sand volleyball court. Their guest list was packed with fun people from inside and outside the neighborhood. Well, all except for one person, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The party kicked off around noon, but Rachel and I didn't get there until about 1. I went straight to the bar to get her a white Zinfandel and a Marrow for myself. We started mingling with the guests first, sticking together before splitting off to chat with different groups inside and out. Everything seemed normal. Every once in a while, I checked in with her to see if she needed another drink or something to eat, and I did the same for me. We'd share a quick kiss before getting back into conversations. I was talking with some of the guys when I noticed a group of new people arriving. There was 1 man and 2 women. Shane greeted them warmly. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Rachel stop mid-conversation and stare at them with a look I couldn't quite place. It was a strange feeling, a mix of surprise and something else. My gut was churning with unease. A few seconds later, she glanced at me, blushed, and then returned to her conversation. You know that feeling when you sense something's off, but you can't quite put your finger on it. That was me. About an hour later, I realized Rachel had disappeared. I grabbed her another glass of wine. I went to get wine and started looking for her. I found her with the new guy. His arm was around her, and his hand was on her hip. It seemed like they'd been talking for a while. But I had a feeling there was more to it. I trusted my wife, but something about this felt wrong. I didn't want to make a scene, but I had to do something. It was a bit of a scene, but I knew I had to do something, so I approached quietly, stepping up behind them and gripping the guy's wrist, pulling his hand away from her waist. We hadn't been introduced yet, though you seem pretty comfortable with my wife. I said firmly, my tone leaving no room for misunderstanding. The guy tried to pull his hand away, but I kept my grip steady. Grip steady, not letting him wriggle free. Rachel was already looking a bit flushed before I arrived, and she turned a deeper shade of red as she realized what was happening. "Oh, Brand, please," she said, clearly embarrassed. "This is Charles Porter. He teaches European literature at the college. He's been there since last year. He's French, and he didn't mean anything by it." I didn't think it was a big deal, and everyone else agreed. I let go of his wrist and shook his hand, making sure the handshake was firm. Rachel introduced me to the others in the group, almost as if she'd momentarily forgotten my presence. "You might want some more wine," I said, handing her the glass. She gave him the glass. My eyes were fixed on Charles. "You're so sweet, my darling husband," she replied, but her words felt a little too forced. Charles, with his thick French accent, looked every bit the classic European academic. He was tall, around 6 feet, probably about 32, with a scruffy beard and hair that seemed undecided between being long or short. I had to admit he was good. He had a certain charisma that made me think he probably charmed quite a few of his students, regardless of gender. Once introductions were out of the way, Charles went right back to rambling about Victor Hugo or some other French writer. I figured I'd made my point, so I excused myself and headed back outside. Later, Rachel and Charles joined us for a game of sand volleyball. I was competitive, and our team was on a winning streak. From what I could see, Rachel and Charles were sitting together on the deck, occasionally laughing and touching each other's arms. Every now and then, I'd glance her way and she'd wave back with a smile. After about an hour of playing, I noticed they were no longer sitting in their spot, glancing around the bar and grill area. I couldn't find them. My legs were tired from the game, so I went to the bar for another glass of Mero. As I wandered around, I had this nagging feeling in my gut. Eventually, I went inside the house to search room after room. I strained my ears for any sound, but there was no sign of Rachel or Charles. I casually approached Lindsay Daniels and asked, I said, to keep my tone light, I saw Rachel around. Oh, she said, not thinking much of it. She and Charles went outside to check something in his car. I paused for a moment, then asked, what is he driving at that moment? It seemed to click for her. Lindsay's casual demeanor faded. A gray SUV. She replied a bit more cautiously, without another word. I walked outside, scanning both ends of the street. No sign of the SUV. A few minutes later, Lindsay joined me in the driveway. I'm sure it's nothing, she said, trying to sound reassuring. They probably just went to campus for a minute. I didn't really believe it, though. The college was only about 5 minutes away, so I decided to check it out for myself. I drove to the school and searched every parking lot, but there was no gray SUV in sight. I called Rachel's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a message and tried for more times over the next hour while I sat at home waiting. I even called her parents and sister, but they hadn't heard from her. That's when an old Sherlock Holmes quote popped into my head. Once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. I was sitting in my favorite chair. Staring at the TV, I tried to make sense of it. My mind kept going back to Rachel and Charles together. Then I thought, why did we ever help the French in the wars? Maybe letting the Germans take over would have been a better idea. I stayed in that chair all night, too wired to sleep. The silence in the room was suffocating. Rachel never came home. By 8:12 a.m. I just couldn't take the uncertainty anymore, so I called the sheriff's office to ask if there had been any accidents involving her car. There hadn't been, and after more calls to her phone yielded nothing, I was starting to think she'd just gone off somewhere. Then, just before noon, I heard a car pull into the driveway. The sound of the door closing sent my heart racing, and about 45 seconds later, I heard her key in the lock and the door creaking open. Rachel walked in quietly, noticing me seated in the family room, and sat down on the couch across from me, still silent. She looked different. At least she had the decency to shower before coming back. Her hair, which had been down and loose the day before, was now pulled back into a damp ponytail. She wasn't wearing makeup. She was still wearing that same yellow dress. Her skin was pink from too much sun. She looked almost serene, like someone who'd had a fantastic time. She didn't seem guilty or ashamed. In fact, she seemed smug. Nice of you to finally show up, I said, sarcasm dripping from every word. Have fun last night? I asked. How about this morning? She replied, smiling. I didn't expect the answer she gave. She said, have you ever had an overwhelming connection with someone? Have you ever felt it from the moment you saw them? It's electric. It's incredible. It's almost magical. Yeah, I answered immediately. That's why I married you. Her calm expression faltered for just a second as her eyes softened with some recognition of what I'd said. She confessed, I found mine yesterday. Her voice was soft but certain. I can't explain it, but I need him. I love him. I exploded just like that. Are you throwing away 25 years of marriage for some feeling? What about me? Did any of this mean anything to you? I do love you. Brand, she cried, her voice shaking. But this is different. I'm in love with him. It's incredible. I tried to hold back my anger, but it slipped through. Give me some time, and I'll throw you a party. I spat bitterly. Do we start the divorce now, or would you like to handle it? We'll split everything down the middle, the house too. She sighed, frustration creeping into her tone. We don't have. Let's not rush into divorce. Let's see what happens first. I've had enough. That's not fair, Rachel. You can't just keep me as your backup plan. If you're with him, go be with him. We were over the moment you went off with him yesterday. But she stammered, fine. I'll handle it. I'll start the divorce process and be out of the house by the end of the week. True to my word, I packed up and moved out within days. I took a couple of personal days from work to get things sorted one evening while loading up my truck. Shane and Lindsay came by too. I apologized for inviting Charles to the party. I told them they couldn't have known how things would turn out. Lindsay avoided eye contact. We feel partly responsible. My lawyer filed the divorce papers, and Rachel was served a month later. It seemed like she hadn't expected me to act so quickly. I heard from the process server that she didn't take it well. Maybe that's why she showed up at my apartment 2 days later. She barged in as soon as I opened the door. How could you do this if you really love? She asked. I tried to stay calm, but my anger surged again. Are you serious? You're with another man? What did you think was going to happen? I love you, but I'm not going to stand by while you cheat on me. Just give me time. She pleaded. If things don't work out, I'll come back. We can grow old together. You're living in a fantasy. I snapped. I'm not going to be your backup while you see if he's really the one. If he is, why wouldn't it work out? She hesitated, then mumbled, he's going through a divorce right now. There are some financial issues. I bet you're perfect for him, but maybe he doesn't see you the same way. I shot back. She couldn't answer, so I told her to leave. I wasn't playing her game, despite her lawyer's attempts to slow things down. The divorce moved forward for months. Later, I ran into Rachel and Charles outside a restaurant. She was visibly pregnant, about 3 months along. Oh my God, I muttered, stunned as we came face to face. I introduced him to Stefan, my colleague, as my wife, well, for a few more months at least, and her boyfriend. Charles Porter Stefan stood there awkwardly, unsure of what to say in such an uncomfortable situation. She's pregnant, Stefan stammered. Is that your baby, or mine? I asked, grinning. You're such a jerk, Rachel snapped, and she and Charles brushed past us, heading into the restaurant. Later, Lindsay Daniels filled me in on the whole situation. It turns out Rachel had indeed stopped using birth control, wanting to have Charles's baby. She was 3 months pregnant. By the time we ran into each other, I told Lindsay I wished her luck with the divorce. It was finalized a few months later, and about 2 months after that, Rachel gave birth to a baby boy. They named him Charles Jr., as if to solidify their admiration for Charles. Our daughter Madison didn't take the news too well. Understandably, she was furious about the split and the fact that I wasn't the father of this new child. I was proud of her for standing by me through the mess. Even though I knew Rachel had the baby, I hadn't actually seen her since our awkward run-in at the restaurant. I figured it was only a matter of time before we bumped into each other again, living in the same small town and all. It just happened sooner than I thought. I was out at the local mall one Saturday when I spotted a woman pushing a stroller. She looked older, heavier, and worn out from the demands of caring for a newborn. It took me a second to realize that the grandmotherly figure in front of me was Rachel. Come on, Brand. No need to be so rude, came a familiar voice. I froze, unable to speak. I turned back and there she was, Rachel with her son. Hey, long time, I said, attempting to sound casual, though I felt anything but. To you too, she replied, a little stiff. Her baby, Charles Jr., was undeniably cute. He inherited Rachel's blonde hair and bright eyes, but had a slightly darker complexion, courtesy of his father. I almost didn't recognize you. I tried to apologize for not recognizing her immediately, but she seemed a little uneasy. She brushed it off with a polite wave of her hand. She looked different. Back when Madison was born, I'd found Rachel incredibly attractive. Now, more than 20 years later, with a child that wasn't mine, those feelings just weren't there anymore. We made small talk for a few minutes, mostly about how exhausted she was from lack of sleep. I could sense the sadness in her. It was different from the glow she had when Madison was born after a quick chat. I said goodbye and went on with my shopping. Our next encounter came about 6 months later at Shane and Lindsay Daniels' annual summer party. They had always felt guilty about introducing Rachel to Charles at one of their parties, but I reassured them it wasn't their fault. That didn't stop Lindsay from trying to set me up with her single or divorced friends, though. I had to admit some of those introductions weren't half bad. After skipping the last 2 parties, I decided to attend this one. I went to one party, even though I knew Rachel and Charles would be there. I wasn't about to cause trouble, I just wanted to hang out with my neighbors and have a good time. A couple of hours in, I spotted them, Rachel and Charles, making their way into the backyard. The baby wasn't with them, so I assumed they'd left him with a sitter. Rachel had lost some of the weight she gained during pregnancy, but there was a tiredness in her eyes and a sadness that even a smile couldn't hide. I decided to deal with the awkwardness head-on, walking over to them. I gave Rachel a quick hug and shook Charles's hand. They looked a bit surprised, but it was nothing serious. I saw Lindsay holding her breath, probably expecting some kind of confrontation, but it didn't happen. We made small talk for a minute before I returned to my friends by the grill. When the sand volleyball game started up, I joined in for the second round. I saw Rachel sitting by herself watching and occasionally cheering. Charles was nowhere to be seen after we lost the game, so I grabbed a beer and noticed Rachel was still sitting alone. Some things never change, I thought to myself as I sipped my drink and wandered indoors to the den. I found what I'd suspected. Charles had his arm around Erica Carson's waist as they chatted with a small group. Erica, who lived just down the street, was clearly into him. She was also very much married. I debated with myself, should I say something? If I stayed quiet, I'd feel responsible. If I spoke up, it would cause chaos. A real friend would tell Rachel, but I wasn't her friend. I used to be her husband. Why should I get involved before I could decide? Erica's husband, Tyler, came into the room. He must have followed me in to discuss the volleyball game. The moment he saw Charles with his wife, he yelled, "Get your hand off my wife. You jerk." Tyler charged toward Charles. For a second, I thought about stepping in to break it up, but then I figured Tyler had every right to handle it himself. Charles could react. Tyler grabbed his arm and twisted hard. A loud crack echoed through the room, followed by Charles's scream. Before long, the commotion had drawn a crowd. A nurse at the party checked on Charles while someone called an ambulance. When it arrived, 2 police officers showed up with it. They interviewed everyone to see if Charles wanted to press charges. The older officer, Sergeant Ethan Lane, looked to be around my age. The younger one, Officer Emily Collins, had a sharp look with unmistakable Irish features. I made sure to tell her my side of the story. Rachel, of course, was in tears, clinging to Charles's uninjured arm as the EMTs worked on him. She clearly had no idea what had led to the altercation. Once Charles was stabilized, the paramedics took him to the hospital. Rachel stayed behind, looking at me for some kind of guidance. I motioned for her to speak with Officer Collins before stepping away. That's nonsense. He's got unmistakable Irish features. I made sure to tell her my side of the story. Rachel was in tears, clinging to Charles's uninjured arm as the EMTs worked on him. She clearly had no idea what had led to the altercation. Once Charles was stabilized, the paramedics took him to the hospital. Rachel stayed behind, looking at me for some kind of guidance. I motioned for her to speak with Officer Collins before stepping away. Collins came over to get my statement, and I told her what had happened. I mentioned that Charles had stolen my wife at a party 3 years ago. She seemed surprised, but here I was, planning to take her to the hospital. She said, "Are you just incredibly kind or utterly foolish?" I wasn't sure how to answer, so I asked her why she asked. She said, "Are you just incredibly kind or utterly foolish?" I replied, and she let out a soft laugh. She seemed to find my story amusing. She was pleasant, and after a few more questions, I finished my statement. She said I could take Rachel to the hospital, but warned me that Rachel might not believe my version of events. I'm not counting on it, I said as I turned to leave. I was about to head out when a sudden impulse hit me. You know, maybe you should give me your card just in case I remember anything else. Officer Collins grinned and pulled a card from her uniform, scribbling down what I figured it was her phone number, so I said, "Thanks, officer," with a laugh. Then I turned to Rachel and let her out on the drive to the hospital. Rachel asked what had happened, so I told her the truth. I doubted she'd believe me, though. "Can't you just move on?" she whined. "It's been 3 years. "It's not about moving on, Rachel," I said. "My guess is that Charles shouldn't have been fooling around with Erica. Tyler was right to do something about it. Maybe if I'd been brave. If I'd been braver back then, you and I would still be together." The words came out unexpectedly, and Rachel started crying. She turned away in the passenger seat, and I dropped her off at the emergency room. After the divorce, she and Charles had moved into a small house using the money we'd made from selling our place. She was tied up for the night. I fished out the card Officer Collins had given me. She seems like a good person, I thought. I decided to wait 3 days before calling. When she answered after 2 rings, her voice had a playful edge. "Could you have waited any longer?" she joked. "I might have gotten engaged by now." I laughed, but I told her that rushing things won't make her the next Mrs. Williams. "Who says?" she quipped. "I'd say yes if you asked me out." Her last comment caught me off guard because that's exactly what I'd planned, taking an Irish. I thought a pub was a fitting choice. She seemed to sense my hesitation and quickly added, "Is there something about you guys? Do I need to have red hair to get you to suggest an Irish pub?" I paused briefly before suggesting my backup plan. There was a fantastic Greek restaurant downtown that I loved and felt was a safe bet. It was definitely a step away from the expected Irish pub. After a moment of thought, she agreed. "Thanks for being open to other options," she said. She said, spontaneous, with a smile when I said no to the Irish pub. "Most guys usually suggest Asian food, but I don't care for it. It looks too much like it might attract bugs." I laughed at her quirky sense of humor, realizing how easy it was to talk with her. We chatted for another hour, covering a range of topics. I found out she was 45, had been divorced for a decade, and her ex had cheated on her. She also had a son in his 2nd year at Michigan State, studying pre-law. Our dinner date that Saturday night was great. I picked her up from her house on the south side of town, and when she opened the door, I was amazed. She wore a black dress, her high heels making her figure look even better, and her red hair cascading down her shoulders. She looked stunning, the kind of beauty that stops you in your tracks. We talked throughout dinner, and it was one of those conversations that seems to go everywhere and nowhere at once. Her voice was captivating. I could have listened to her all night. She wasn't rushing towards settling down, and I wasn't either. This made her relaxed and refreshingly unpredictable. Her curious nature shone through as she asked probing questions and listened intently to everything I said. After dinner, I drove her home. Neither of us made any moves to extend the evening. As I walked her to her door, she surprised me by giving me a quick kiss on the cheek. I turned beet red. I said goodnight and floated back to my car, barely remembering the drive home. It felt like I was 16 again. Her kiss lingered in my thoughts, and I was pretty sure she was wearing white shoulder perfume. The next morning, she called and invited me over for bagels and lox. How could I say no? A few days later, Scott and Lindsay invited me to dinner. They wanted to make amends for the chaos at the recent party and hear my side of the story. I heard that Charles had been threatening legal action against both of them and Tyler. "Carson, doesn't this guy think he's God's gift to the world?" Scott blurted out at one point. Lindsay, in a rare moment of calm, responded, "He is quite handsome and undeniably charming," earning a sharp look from Scott. From what they told me, Tyler had spent the rest of the weekend in jail, only getting bailed out on Monday morning when he returned home. Erica and their kids were gone. They've gone to stay with her mother in a nearby town. Scott figured their marriage might be over after 12 years. He told Tyler he should talk to me. I said I get what he's going through and I'll support him in court if it comes to that. We'll let him know. Scott replied, I'm sure he'll appreciate the help. Then Scott sighed. By the way, we've decided this will be the last summer party we host. It's just too much stress. As Scott spoke, I noticed Lindy was fixated on. Her plate of peas was untouched, and it was obvious that things hadn't been right between them since the party a few months earlier. Lindsay's baby bump started showing, confirming my suspicions. I didn't need to guess who the father was. Scott called to let me know. He was pretty upset. He hadn't caught on until Lindsay started experiencing morning sickness, which was the same pattern she'd had before. Scott confronted her about the affair. She admitted that she and Charles had been involved for over a year. She said that they mostly used protection, but that they ran out during a weekend getaway and decided to risk it. Scott jokingly asked for a referral to my divorce attorney, saying he hoped there was a friends and family discount. Apparently, Charles and Lindsay had moved into an apartment near the college. Rachel and her son would have to fend for themselves. It wasn't my problem. I replied, I didn't realize how complicated people could be. One afternoon, while grabbing lunch at a nearby McDonald's, Rachel and her son walked over to my table. She sat down across from me, placing her tray on the table, while CJ sat next to me. Hi, Rachel. Hi, CJ, I greeted them. Hello, sir, CJ replied politely. I glanced at him. He was growing up fast. I commented to Rachel, you might have a future. Rachel's expression softened, and she acknowledged my attempt to be polite. However, there was still an uneasiness in her eyes, as if she was holding back something she needed to get off her chest. I didn't press her, but the tension was clear. I gently encouraged her as I watched CJ unwrap his cheeseburger. Rachel looked at me, her voice soft and uncertain. She asked, did you really love me as much as you said you did? If you loved me as much as Tyler loved Erica, why didn't you fight for me? Why didn't you ask me to come back? Why haven't you visited to check on me and our son? Maybe even invite us over? I was blindsided by her words. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. So now it's my fault, huh? My voice rose unintentionally. That wasn't the plan, but I wanted to make my point clear. I said, remember when? I pulled Charles's hand off your waist, and you told me not to make a scene. I trusted you completely, and I let it go. If I'd known then what I know now, I wouldn't have. When you came home the next day, the damage was already done. You'd broken our vows. What was left to fight for? You'd made your choice. Her voice cracked as she countered, but you never tried to change my mind. You didn't ask me to stay. I didn't hold back. If you truly, how many times did you sleep with Charles that night? I'm sure it was more than once. The first time could have been a mistake, but after that it was a choice. You told me you had a great time and a magical connection. You didn't feel guilty at all. What was I supposed to think? Love and lust are only 4 letters apart. Then you had his baby at 48. After 25 years of telling me you didn't want another child, you let Mr. I was really happy that you had a baby. I thought you'd be pleased. But I guess I was wrong. I was supposed to just watch it all happen. I was hurt by your next comment. Is this all about your wounded male ego? I bit my tongue, glancing at CJ. I wasn't about to lose my cool with the kid sitting right there. Rachel, I said calmly, this is about your choices. You loved him enough to have his child when you never wanted another with me. I get it. Silence hung between us. I could tell she was unsure where to go from here. I decided to bring up the next topic on my mind. I asked, what are you planning to do now? You never married Charles, but he's the father. You should at least ask him for child support. She nodded slowly and said, yeah, you're right. I should get child support. She paused before asking, do you ever think about what could have been? I replied quietly, "No, I don't think about what could have been. You hurt me so badly that I don't let myself. I'll remember the good times we had, but that's all in the past." We kept eating, and I watched CJ playing with his fries. He reminded me so much of Madison when she was that age. "He's a good kid," I said softly. "I'm glad something good came out of all of this." Rachel nodded, her eyes filling with tears. She seemed to realize at that moment what she had lost, real love in exchange for something fleeting. I just celebrated our 10th anniversary with a trip to Spain. I told her it wasn't exactly what we'd planned, but it was perfect. Our bond is stronger than ever. I love her more each day, especially with our kids and grandkids. Life is full of happiness now. I see Rachel around town occasionally, but we hardly talk. She's focused on raising CJ, who's 13 now. She never remarried and rarely dates. As for Charles, he had to be forced. Rachel's life seems a bit sad now that she's having to pay child support, but we all make our own choices in the end. Thanks for watching this emotional story of love, lust, and lies. I hope it touched your heart. If you enjoyed it, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a fresh story every day. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, so feel free to share your experiences and tell your story.